You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Nancy Fielder, Editor-in-Chief of National World Cities, and Jake Wallace-Simons, Editor of the Jewish Chronicle. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Tax wars is the headline on the front page of the Metro, after Labour kicked off its party conference by promising to scrap the Tory tax cuts. That story also features on the front page of The Guardian, which highlights Sir Keir Starmer's pledge to reinstate the 45p tax rate for the highest earners. The Mirror leads with comments from footballer Gary Neville, who says the government's tax cuts are immoral. The tax cut theme continues on the front page of the FT, which focuses on suggestions the Chancellor could slash taxes even further. The Daily Mail labels those plans for even more tax cuts as Quess's boost for families. The Express front page is also focused on the economy and Liz Truss's promise of growth. The Times headline reads, "Pay pain for workers as public sector squeezed after the government abandoned plans for a new spending review." And finally, on the front page of The Star, new revelations in the Q-Gate saga involving Holly Willoughby and Philip Schofield. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And I'm joined tonight by Nancy Fielder and Jake Wallace-Simons. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with The Guardian. And the quote there from Sir Keir Starmer: "I will reinstate 45p tax to back public services." So that is one tax that he would reinstate, but not the other, not the 1 penny. Jake?
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, it's totally predictable, of course, that Keir Starmer would latch on to this abolishment of the highest rate of tax because it suits, his base and his agenda. And don't forget, the highest rate of tax was introduced by Gordon Brown just before he left office as a sort of trap for the Tories, tempting them to roll it back and then face the public wrath as a result of doing so. But I think that it's important to see this in the overall context of the figures. The highest rate of tax raises about £2 billion a year for the tax takings for the government. And overall, the government's tax takings is £900 billion a year. If Keir Starmer seeks to direct this £2 billion towards the NHS, the NHS itself costs about £150 billion. So these are very small numbers that we're talking about. And set against this, let's not forget that the top 1% of earners pay about 28% roughly of our taxes. And so you can see why this is, an easy goal for Keir Starmer. But when you look at the figures, it's quite a small amount. And from the point of view of the government, it's worth sending a signal that Britain is open for business, is no longer in the thrall of the politics of envy, and seeking to attract high net worth individuals to Britain to help get the economy moving. So you can see that makes sense from Labour's point of view to make this an argument, but actually within the overall context of the figures doesn't necessarily raise very much money at all.
Do you agree with that, Nancy, that it actually doesn't raise very much money?
I'm not sure I do, to be honest, and I'm a little bit fed up with the sort of politics of envy phrase. We're not talking about envy because everybody wants to be a millionaire. We're talking about very basic things that people can't afford to do. We're talking about a country that is rife with food mass because people can't afford to buy enough food to feed their families. Everybody is worried about how bills are going up. It's still going to get worse and worse. And yet all we're seeing from the government is more support for the people who have already got the most money. But it is quite refreshing now. I mean, we are back away from all the middle ground of Conservative and Labour policies that were a little bit hard to pick between. But this is really a Conservative government doing exactly what you would expect, and the Labour Party fighting back again with exactly what you would expect. So I think this is what the Labour Party should do to aim for its voters and the working people who are being given a really rough ride all the way along, to be honest.
And people saying that this mini-budget was anything but. There were so many changes, but the Chancellor promising that there's more to come when we look at the Daily Mail. Jake?
That's right. I mean, this was far from a mini budget. This was an earthquake in British politics and in British history. I mean, as Nancy pointed out, this is a huge departure from the vying for the centre ground that we've seen over the last, 20, 30 years, really, in politics since Blair onwards. But she also makes a very fair point about, the poorest people in society and the support that they need. And I guess what the Tories are trying to do now under Liz Truss is prioritise growth at all costs, this sort of kamikaze drive for growth. Every policy is geared towards creating growth based upon a very potent ideology of tax cuts to create economic stimulus, but also supply side reform. And it's important that, people on lower incomes, people who aren't working and so forth, are not caught in the crossfire, as it were, but they also receive benefits and boosts that they need in this time of a huge cost of living crisis. And this story on the front of the Mail goes some way towards suggesting that there might be some help for working families with, for example, one person staying at home to look after the children. They may benefit from tax cuts targeted at them as well. So this is a very broad agenda, a hugely broad agenda that's being put forward by the new Truss administration. And, we can all just cross our fingers and hope that it works, because our backs are to the wall in this country.
Nancy, do you believe the Chancellor when he says that he is there to help families struggling with the cost of living? He said, we've only been here 19 days. I want to see over the next year people retain more of their income, because I believe that's the British people, that it's British people that are going to drive this economy. So he's saying that he is actually helping those that you're talking of.
He is saying that, but actually there isn't a massive amount of detail. This is looking forward to things that may come. But the two things that are mentioned is the changes around child benefit, which impacts families who are earning over £50,000, and helping families where one of the parents stays at home and doesn't work. Now, most of the people who are struggling, the parents are absolutely out working because they couldn't possibly afford to have somebody at home, and they're unlikely to be getting enough here to be able to just quit their jobs. And actually £50,000 that impacted on child benefit is a really good, strong salary compared to most of the people we're talking about here. So I'm not convinced that what he's aiming for here is any different than what he's been doing already. I don't think it will help the people who need it most. And I think it's great to be looking out for families, but I don't see any detail here that will help the families who are struggling the most, I'm afraid.
And Jake, what can we read into the markets on the announcement of the mini budget, a 37-year low for the pound against the dollar? Tory backbenchers and potentially cabinet ministers also getting the jitters a little bit as regards to the economy and the pound.
Absolutely. I mean, the markets are spooked. Let's make no bones about that. They are totally spooked. And some of the government supporters have been arguing that that's because the government's actions have been talked down so much by the establishment, the liberal media and the kind of financial elites and so on and so forth. But there's no two ways about it. The pound has plunged and the markets are spooked. And I think that the markets would have taken a lot of this. They would have taken the reverses, the national insurance rise to corporation tax, to kind of steady the ship. They would have taken the great boost in terms of lowering our energy payments. They would have taken that because that's kind of in line with what other European countries are doing. But it's really the ideologically motivated tax cuts which has spooked the markets, which nobody expected to come. And that's really what's created the havoc on the markets overall and caused the pound to plunge. Now, personally, I sort of share those sorts of politics that wishes to see a low tax, high growth economy. But even I feel a little bit nervous about the speed at which this is happening and the pace at which it's taking place. So, like I said, we're all rooting for the government in a way, and for the country. Even people who disagree with the government, I think, is hoping that this will succeed and return us to growth and get us out of this cost of living crisis.
OK, for the moment, thank you both. Jake and Nancy, we'll leave it there for the moment. We're going to take a break. Coming up, more papers, including this story on the front of the Financial Times. Italy election polls point to Meloni victory as the country elects its most right-wing government since Mussolini. Stay with us for more on that. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Nancy Fielder and Jake Wallace-Simons. Let's take a look at the FT. They're looking at the Italian election, their front page. Exit polls suggesting that Giorgia Meloni is victorious and will be with her coalition, far-right coalition that it will be. Jake, your assessment?
Yes, I mean, it looks like Meloni will win. And I think there is a lot of hysteria about her, calling her far right. But if you look at her policies, they are more like a traditional conservative rather than far right. She looks to people like Roger Scruton in Britain and even Tolkien. She's very Christian in terms of the culture wars. She speaks very strongly against things like gay adoption, that sort of thing.
Well, she describes herself as centre-right, doesn't she? But elements of the coalition would be far-right. Thinking of Salvini.
Yes, I think. And also the other important point is that she leads a party that has its roots in Mussolini's Italy. And so that immediately casts a pall over it, even if she herself has disavowed the anti-Semitism and the other fascist principles that Mussolini espoused. In this, she's similar to something like perhaps the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, who've just entered a coalition as well, who come from a far-right Nazi past, but are saying they've broken with that tradition. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why people are worried about her. This isn't just empty, these aren't just empty concerns. But at the same time, it's for everyone to judge whether those contexts are worth condemning her for, or whether one should judge her by her policies and what she actually says. And it's quite a nerve-wracking time, really, for Europe, I think.
Yes, I mean, many commentators saying that Italy is heading towards the most right-wing government since World War II, Nancy.
Yes, absolutely. And it does feel like she has shifted to make herself more electable rather than actually changing her beliefs. So it is going to be really interesting how it plays out and whether she has just sort of made herself more acceptable to more people rather than changing her original thoughts, and quite a lot of them are very, very right-wing. It's particularly worrying around Ukraine. I've seen quotes kind of saying, the only person who will be celebrating this, well, the first person who will be celebrating this is in Russia and will be Putin. So this is going to put huge strain on all sorts of relationships across Europe, and it is a really worrying time. She's the first woman to have been elected in this job in Italy. But I think there are greater concerns as we wait and see how it unrolls.
Final look at the Telegraph. Just got time to fit this story in, and this is the United States warning of the consequences if Vladimir Putin does use nuclear weapons. Very disturbing, distressing, in fact, Jake.
Yes, I just wanted to correct that point that Meloni has been distinct as giving support to Ukraine rather than like some of her competitors who are quite pro-Putin. But just that aside, absolutely, Putin gave a not very heavily veiled nuclear threat once again to the West last week. And now it's the turn of the Americans to respond. Jake Sullivan revealing that he's given, in no uncertain terms, some warnings about catastrophic consequences to the Russians at a high level were nuclear weapons to be used. I think that this is something which Putin must take seriously and hopefully will take seriously, because he would almost certainly, if he were to use nuclear weapon, it would be a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon. It wouldn't be a missile launched at New York or London. And the consequences he would face would be from an overwhelmingly stronger United States, let alone the other democratic allies that stand in NATO. And this war has shown just how relatively feeble Russia is by comparison to the West. And so, the balance of power remains very firmly in the West's favor. And I think that he would do well to recognize that. And we would do well to be confident in that, although without downplaying the horrible threat that he's aired last week.
Yeah, and just to read Jake Sullivan's quote, if Russia crosses this line, there will be catastrophic consequences. The United States will respond decisively. Jake and Nancy, for the moment, thank you so much. We'll see you in the next hour.